I never told anyone what I saw that night. Ramon Castillo said those words 30 years later. His hands were shaking. He was 60 years old, a grandfather, a man who had seen plenty. And still, those words came out like something trapped, like he had been waiting 3 decades to say them. Bruce Lee walked into Temple Street that evening like any other father. His young son was on his shoulders, his wife beside him, laughing at something small. Nobody on that street knew what was coming. March 1967, the city of Los Angeles, Chinatown, Temple Street, 9:14 p.m. Lanterns swayed above the narrow road. The air smelled like rain and roasting duck from the corner stalls. Normal sounds. Normal night. Before everything changed, Marco Vega was already waiting, 6'2", 230 pounds, hands built from years of hard use. A scar above his left eye, a story he never explained. He had protected this street for 11 years. Every shopkeeper knew his name. Every family paid him quietly. That was his order, his world. What Marco didn't know, the man walking toward him had ended fights before Marco could blink. What Marco didn't understand, size had never mattered in those fights. What Marco was about to learn would stay with him for the rest of his life. And what Ramon Castillo witnessed from the doorway of his shop that night would take him 30 years to say out loud. 7 men spread across the mouth of the alley. Marco stepped forward, voice calm, the dangerous kind of calm. He told Bruce Lee to hand over his wallet, leave the woman, walk away without the boy. Bruce Lee set his young son down, gently, quietly told his wife to step back. Then he turned around. This is what happened in the next 90 seconds. March 14th, 1967, 9:02 p.m. Bruce Lee had spent the evening at a small restaurant 2 blocks east on Temple Street. A quiet dinner. No students, no cameras, just his wife and his young son. He was heading home on foot. He liked to walk Chinatown at night. He said the streets at night reminded him of Hong Kong. Narrow alley, brick walls, lantern light catching wet stone. Marco Vega was there for a different reason. Earlier that day, he had received information. A man was coming through his territory. An outsider. Someone who did not respect the way Temple Street worked. The information came from David Sung, owner of a martial arts school 4 blocks north. What Sung told Marco was a lie, every word of it. But Marco didn't know that yet. Ramon Castillo, a shopkeeper who had lived on Temple Street for 12 years, was closing his hardware store when he saw Marco's crew gathering in the alley. He stepped back into the doorway. He didn't leave. But who was Marco Vega? Marco Arturo Vega, 34 years old, 6'2", 230 pounds. And as the scar above his left eye had been there since 1959. He never talked about how he got it. People on Temple Street had learned not to ask. He wore the same thing every night he worked. Dark jacket, dark trousers, boots worn down at the heel. He moved with the kind of patience that only comes from knowing you are the biggest thing in the room. Marco had been operating on Temple Street since 1956, 11 years. In that time, he had built something that most people on the outside would call extortion. Marco called it protection. And in his mind, it was. Before Marco, Temple Street had been chaotic. Robberies, vandalism, a stabbing in 1954 that nobody was ever charged for. Marco had ended all of that. Not with police, not with law, with presence, with reputation, with the simple fact that nobody wanted to test him twice. The shopkeepers paid him, not happily, but they paid, and the street was safe. That was the deal. And what Marco didn't understand was that a deal built on fear is always one moment away from collapse. He grew up in East Los Angeles, 3rd of 5 children. His father worked the docks. Long hours, small money, a man too tired to be present. His mother held the family together with a quiet determination that Marco admired his whole life and never said out loud. The formative moment came when Marco was 16. His younger brother Danny was cornered by three older boys near a bus stop. Marco arrived too late to stop it, but early enough to answer it. He put all three of them on the ground. Not with skill, with size and fury, and the specific rage of a brother who had failed to protect. Something locked into place that evening. Protection was the thing. It was the only thing that mattered. From that night forward, Marco built himself around one belief. If you are strong enough, nothing bad happens to the people around you. He believed this completely. It was the belief of a man who had never met someone stronger. Marco had a system, and systems, to men like Marco, were sacred. The moment Bruce Lee stepped onto Temple Street without checking in, without acknowledging the order Marco had spent 11 years building, it was not just a violation. It was a statement. Or so David Sung had told him. What Marco was protecting that night wasn't money. It was an idea. A role he had built his entire identity around. He was the guardian of Temple Street. If he let one man through unchallenged, what was he? What Marco didn't know. That question was already the wrong one. He arrived at the alley entrance at 9:09 p.m. 6 men fanned out behind him. Ramon Castillo, watching from the hardware store doorway, said later that Marco moved like a man who had already decided how the night would end. Calm, certain, in control. He was none of those things. He just didn't know it yet. Bruce Lee saw them before they moved. Yeah, and he always did. His wife felt it first. A change in the way he walked. Slower, more deliberate. He reached up and lifted his young son from his shoulders, set him down beside his wife, said something quiet. She pulled the boy close and stepped toward the wall. Ramon Castillo, 20 feet away in the shadow of the doorway, held his breath. Marco stepped forward. His 6 men spread wide behind him, cutting off the exit. "This is Temple Street," Marco said. "You don't walk through here without my knowing." Bruce Lee looked at him, then at the men fanned out behind him, then back at Marco. "I am walking home," Bruce Lee said. Quiet, not aggressive, simply factual. "Not tonight," Marco said. 3 of Marco's men shifted their weight, hands coming out of pockets. Ramon Castillo watched Bruce Lee's posture change. Not tense, not afraid, something else. Something that Ramon spent 30 years trying to describe correctly. "He went still," Ramon said, "like the air before a storm goes still. Something is about to happen, you just don't know how big." "Wallet," Marco said, "then you walk the other direction." Bruce Lee looked at Marco for a long moment. "My son is watching," Bruce Lee said. It was not a plea. It was not a warning. It was information. Marco didn't understand the difference. He nodded at his men. The first one moved. "Everything you've heard so far? That was the setup. What happened in the next 90 seconds became legend. This is how it unfolded." The first man came fast, right side, reaching for Bruce Lee's collar. He grabbed air. Bruce Lee had moved 3 inches to the left. That was all. 3 inches. But the man's momentum carried him forward. His own weight became the problem. One precise redirection. The man went into the wall, not violently, controlled, like a door being closed. Ramon Castillo's mouth opened. He didn't make a sound. The second man came from the left, bigger, slower, more committed. He didn't reach Bruce Lee either. Marco's eyes narrowed. What Marco didn't understand yet, Bruce Lee had not been defending. He had been observing. Marco sent 2 men at once, left and right, coordinated, the way men do when they have practiced it. Bruce Lee moved between them. One strike landed on the left man's solar plexus. The sound was like a palm hitting wet leather. Sharp, compact, absolute. The right man caught an elbow redirect that spun him into the brick wall. Both men were down in under 2 seconds. Ramon Castillo later said, "I have watched boxing. I have watched street fights. I have never seen anyone move like that. It wasn't violence, it was geometry. Marco stepped forward now. Personally, this detail would matter later. Marco was not slow. That was the thing nobody expected. A man his size. People assumed he would lumber. He didn't. He had been in enough real situations to know how to close distance fast. His first strike caught Bruce Lee on the left cheekbone. Clean contact. Real force. Bruce Lee's head snapped back. He staggered. One step, then two. Ramon Castillo's chest tightened. Marco surged forward. Both hands coming now, trying to press the advantage. His left hand caught Bruce Lee's shoulder. His right was moving toward his jaw. For 6 seconds, Marco Vega had him. 6 seconds of real danger, real vulnerability. Marco felt it, felt the certainty flood back in. I've got him, he thought. Size always wins in close quarters. He believed that completely. He was about to stop believing it. Bruce Lee dropped his weight, not away from Marco, into him. His center of gravity shifted in a fraction of a second. Low, sudden, unexpected. Marco's grip found nothing solid. 2 strikes, precise locations, forearm, then the side of the neck, not designed to destroy, designed to interrupt. Marco's legs went uncertain. His balance broke the way a heavy door breaks, slowly at first, then all at once. Bruce Lee guided him down, controlled. No more force than necessary. Marco hit the ground on his side. His remaining men did not move. The alley went completely silent. Stay down, Bruce Lee said. Marco stayed down. 90 seconds. Exactly. The fight was over. 90 seconds. Bruce Lee walked back toward his wife and son. Story done. Except the alley smelled like stone and cold air and the faint grease of nearby restaurant kitchens. 4 men were sitting or lying on the ground. 3 had backed against the far wall, not running, not advancing, just still, like men who had been given information they needed time to process. Marco was on his side, breathing carefully. His ribs ached with the specific insistence of something that had been struck correctly. His neck felt like a dial had been turned, not broken, reset. He was not unconscious. He was completely, utterly aware. And that was worse, because being aware meant replaying it. The way it had ended, the speed of it, the absence of anger in every movement Bruce Lee made. Bruce Lee stood over him for a moment. Then he crouched down, extended his hand. Marco stared at it, open palm, offered genuinely, no performance in it. You protected your street, Bruce Lee said. That is not nothing. Marco said nothing. Strength is only one tool, Bruce Lee said quietly. You are using it as if it is all of them. He did not wait for a response. He stood, walked back to his wife, lifted his young son onto his shoulders. The boy said something. Bruce Lee laughed, a quiet, genuine. And they walked off Temple Street, like a family finishing an evening walk. Like 7 men in an alley had been a small inconvenience on the way home. Ramon Castillo didn't move for a full minute. Father Alejandro Reyes, the Catholic priest who walked Temple Street every evening on his nightly route, had stopped at the far end of the alley when the confrontation began. He had not run, had not intervened. He stood in the lamplight with his rosary in his hand watching. He later told Ramon, I have seen mercy in many forms in my life. That night it looked like restraint. It looked like a man who could have done far more, choosing not to. Ramon nodded when Father Reyes said this. He had been thinking the same thing for 30 years. Marco sat alone in his car outside a hardware store on the edge of Chinatown. Engine off. Rain beginning on the windshield. His ribs made breathing deliberate. Each inhale reminded him of the 2 strikes. Each exhale reminded him of the ground. He replayed the alley, not the part where he lost, the part before, The way Bruce Lee had set his young son down, gently, without panic, without performance, like nothing in the world mattered more than making sure that boy felt safe. Marco had done that too. Every evening, his own son, 6 years old, would be waiting at the door. Running toward him the moment the lock turned, Marco would lift the boy up, hold him, set him down. The same gesture, the same instinct. But something about the way Bruce Lee did it, in the middle of 7 men with no panic in his hands, hit Marco in a place he hadn't expected. That man had been afraid. Marco was certain of it. Any father would be afraid. But his fear had not reached his hands. Marco looked at his own hands, open on his knees. Still, he thought about David Sung, the tip, the information that had sent 7 men into that alley. What Marco didn't know yet, Sung had lied to him completely. Bruce Lee had never heard of Marco Vega, had no interest in Temple Street, was simply walking home. That truth was still 3 days away. But sitting in that car at 11:30 p.m., Marco already felt something moving. Like a door he had kept shut for 11 years was developing a crack. He just couldn't name what was on the other side yet. The story had already spread through Chinatown. Not accurately. Never accurately. By the second day, Marco's 6 men had become 12. By the third, someone was saying Bruce Lee had used a weapon. Ramon Castillo heard 7 different versions in 3 days. Not one of them mentioned what happened after the fight. The hand extended, the words spoken. None of them. That detail, and the most important detail, had been completely lost. On the afternoon of March 17th, Marco learned the truth about David Sung. A contact told him, straightforward. Sung had fabricated the story entirely. Professional jealousy. He had wanted someone to send Bruce Lee a message, and had used Marco to do it. Marco sat with this information for a long time. He had put his men in that alley based on a lie, had threatened a man's wife, his young son, based on a lie. The guardian of Temple Street had been used like a tool by someone with a grudge. That evening, Marco's younger brother Danny found him sitting on the steps outside his apartment. "You need to find that man," Danny said, "not to fight him. The other reason." Marco looked at his brother for a long time. "I know," Marco said. Marco Vega made his decision. What he decided, nobody on Temple Street expected. The collection stopped, not gradually, not slowly wound down. Stopped. Marco went to each shopkeeper personally, early morning, before the street filled up. He stood in each doorway, told them the arrangement was over. No explanation, no drama, no conditions. Some of them stared at him like he was speaking another language. One woman, the owner of a tea shop who had been paying Marco for 8 years, asked him why. Marco thought about it. "Because I was protecting you from things that wouldn't have happened," he said, and calling it strength. Ramon Castillo was the 4th person he visited that morning. "He stood in my doorway," Ramon said. "He looked different, not smaller, not defeated, just different. Like something heavy had been put down and he was still figuring out how to walk without it." Marco didn't disappear from Temple Street. He stayed. But the nature of his presence changed completely. He began working with young men in the neighborhood. Teenagers, mostly. Boys who reminded him of himself at 16. Too much anger, nowhere to put it, no one paying attention. He had no formal curriculum to offer, no title, no program with a name. What he offered was simpler and rarer, the full attention of a man who had been where they were and had found a different direction. He told them about the alley, not to impress them, to make them understand that the version of himself from March 1967 was a man who had confused control with care. "Strength is only one tool," he would say, and then some of the boys eventually asked him where he had heard that. He never told them. 3 of those young men later went on to careers that surprised the neighborhood. One became a firefighter. One became a teacher. One eventually ran a youth center 2 blocks north of Temple Street. on the same block where David Sung's martial arts school had stood. The firefighter, years later, said, "Marco never talked about what changed him, but we all knew something had. You can feel the difference between a man who controls people out of fear and a man who guides them out of choice. Marco became the second kind, completely." David Sung's school closed within the year. Some said it was the reputation. Some said it was something else. The truth was more ordinary. A school built on the idea of controlling a neighborhood has nothing to offer once the neighborhood stops needing to be controlled. Sung moved on. Nobody on Temple Street noted his leaving. Marco was in his kitchen when his wife turned on the radio. Bruce Lee was dead, 32 years old. The city of Hong Kong. Marco stood very still for a long time. His wife put her hand on his arm. She didn't know the story. Not fully. He had told her pieces. Marco went to the window. The street outside looked like any other evening. He thought about the hand extended in the alley, the words spoken quietly. Strength is only one tool. 6 years. He had been living those words for 6 years without ever going back to say thank you. He never got the chance. That night, Marco sat with his son, now 12 years old, and told him the story. All of it. The alley. The lie. The hand extended. The choice he made afterward. His son listened without interrupting. When Marco finished, the boy said, "So he didn't just beat you?" "No," Marco said. "He showed me something." "What?" "That you are not strong because of what you can do to people," Marco said. "You are strong because of what you choose not to do." Ramon Castillo was 60 years old when he finally told the story out loud. Inasa, his grandson, was 8, sitting beside him on the steps of the hardware store. Still open, same corner, different sign. The boy had asked about a photograph on the wall inside. A man in a dark jacket, a street at night. Ramon in his 20s standing nearby. "Who is that?" "That is Marco Vega," Ramon said. "Who was he?" Ramon looked at the photograph for a long time before answering. "He was the man who protected this street," Ramon said. "And then one night he learned what protection actually means, and he became a different kind of man." "What changed him?" Ramon smiled. 90 seconds, he said. "And what happened after?" "The story survived because people like Ramon kept it, not the fight. Anyone can tell a fight story. But the part after, the hand extended, the words, the choice. Danny Vega, Marco's younger brother, told the story at Marco's funeral in 1998. And he said, "My brother spent the first 34 years of his life believing that strength was about controlling what you could force people to do. He spent the rest of his life understanding that real strength is about what you refuse to do with it. One man on one night on Temple Street showed him the difference, and my brother spent 30 years paying that lesson forward." Bruce Lee believed that martial arts was not about mastering techniques. It was about mastering yourself well enough to choose how you acted, even when every instinct was pushing you toward destruction. That night in March 1967 in the city of Los Angeles on Temple Street, he did not just protect his family. He protected Marco Vega from the version of himself that would have taken Marco somewhere he could not come back from. Neither of them knew that. The legacy Bruce Lee left on Temple Street was never a story about a fight. It was a story about what a man chose to do when the fight was already over. It's 90 seconds. That is how long it lasted. The lesson lasted a lifetime. You are not strong because you can hurt people. You are strong because, when you could, you chose not to.